Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Section 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. A Midsummer Ramble Through the Dolomites. Section 5. Chapter 3. Longarone to Cortina, Part 1. Longarone, seen at 6 o'clock on a grey, dull morning, looked no more attractive than at dusk the evening before. There had been thunder and heavy rain in the night, and now the road and footways were full of muddy pools. The rider, however, was up betimes, wandering alone through the wet streets, peeping into the tawdry churches, spelling over the framed and glazed announcements of births, deaths, and marriages at the Prefectura, sketching the Piccolina, a solitary, conspicuous peak over against the mouth of the Val Vaillant, on the opposite bank of the Piave, and seeking such scattered crumbs of information as might fall in her way. To sketch, even so early as 6 a.m., without becoming the nucleus of a crowd, is, of course, impossible, and the crowd this time consisted of school-children of all ages, quite as untamable and almost as numerous as the flies of Santa Croce. Presently, however, came by a mild, plump priest in a rusty soutane, who chased the truants off to the parish schoolhouse, and himself lingered for a little secular chat by the way. He had not much to tell, yet he told the little that he knew pleasantly and readily. The parish, he said, numbered about 3,000 souls, a pious, industrious folk mainly supported by the timber trade, which is the staple of these parts. This timber, being cut, sold, and branded in the Empeso Thal, is floated down the Boita to its point of convergence with the Piave at Perarolo, and thence, carried by the double current, comes along the valley of the Piave and the Val di Mel, to be claimed by its several purchasers along the banks, and caught as it passes by. Thus it is that every village by the way is skirted by sawmills and timber yards, and that almost every man is a carpenter. He then went on to tell me that my peak was called the Piccolina, or Hen's Beak, that there existed a practicable short cut for pedestrians by way of the Val Vaillant to Udine and the Trieste railway, that the Gran Tiziano was born on the banks of the Piave higher up, at Pieve de Cadore, that the Dolomites were the highest mountains in the world, which I am afraid I pretended to believe, that the large church in the piazza was the church of the Concezione, that the little church at the back, dedicated to San Liberale, was the smallest church in Italy, which no doubt was true, seeing that you might put it inside St. Lawrence, Undercliff, and yet leave a passage to walk round, and finally that Cazzo Lavazzo, seen from a point about a quarter of a mile farther on, was the most picturesque view in the valley, and the best worth sketching. Having delivered himself of which information, apocryphal and otherwise, he lifted his shovel hat with quite the air of a man of the world, and bade me good morning. Of course I went at once in search of the view of Castel Lavasso, and finding it really characteristic of the Val di Pieve, succeeded in sketching it before it was time to return to breakfast. By 9 we were on the road again, following the narrow gorge that was soon to lead us into the real world of Dolomite. The morning was now alternately bright and showery, and the dark, jagged peaks that closed in the distance were of just that rich, deep, incredible ultramarine blue that Titian loved and painted so often in his landscape backgrounds. At Termine, a little timber-worked hamlet noisy with sawmills, about a mile beyond Cazzo Lavazzo, the defile narrows so suddenly that one gigantic grey and golden crag seems to block the end of the village street. The women here are handsome, and wear folded cloths upon their heads, as in the hills near Rome, and the men wear wooden clogs, as at Lugano. A slender waterfall wavers down the face of a cliff on the opposite side of the river. Primitive breakwaters, like huge baskets of rude wickerwork filled with stones, here stem the force of the torrent brawling through its narrow bed, and some of these have had their place so long that young trees have had time to take root and flourish in them. Next comes Ospitale, another little brown-roofed hamlet perched on a green rise like Castel Lavazzo, with the usual cluster of sawmills and saw-pits down by the water's edge, And now, entering the commune of Perarolo in a smart shower, we rattle through a succession of tiny villages built in the Swiss way, with wooden balconies, outer staircases, and deep projecting eaves. In most of these places, it being now between 10 and 11 o'clock a.m., the good people are sitting in their doorways dining primitively out of wooden bowls. So we go on, and so the Piave, greenish in color, interrupted by 1,000 rapids, noisy, eager, headlong, comes ever rushing towards us, and past us, and away to the sea. So, too, the brown and gold pine trunks come whirling down with the stream. It is curious to watch them in their course. Some singly, some in crowds. Some blunder along sideways in a stupid, buffeted, bewildered way. Some plunge madly up and down. Some run races. Some get tired, rest a while under the shelter of the bank, and then, with a rouse and a shake, dash back again into the throng. Others creep into little stony shallows, and there go to sleep for days and weeks together, while others again push straight ahead, nose first, as if they knew what they were about, and were bent on getting to their journey's end as quickly as possible. Nearing Perarolo, glimpses of the peaks, anguilles, and snowfields of Monte Credola, 8,474 feet, the highest point of the Prima Maggiore range, are now and then seen to the right, through the openings in the lower mountains. Monte Zucco abruptly blocks the end of the gorge. Country carts upon the road, women working in the fields, a party of children scrambling and shouting among the bushes by the wayside, now indicate that we are not far from a more thickly inhabited place than any of the preceding villages. Then the road takes a sudden turn, and Perarolo, with its handsome new church, new stone bridge, public fountain, extensive wood yards, and general air of solid prosperity, comes into view. Yet a few yards farther, and a second bridge is crossed, a new valley rich in wood and water opens away to the left, and a wonderful, majestic vision, draped in vapors and hooded in clouds, stands suddenly before us. The coachman, preparing his accustomed coup de théâtre, is not allowed to speak. We know at once in what presence we are. We know at once that yonder vague and shadowy mass which soars beyond our sight and seems to gather up the slopes of the valley, as a robe, can be none other than the Antileo. A grand but a momentary sight. The coachman, with a jealous glance at the open maps and guidebooks that have forestalled his information, whips on his horses, and in another moment valley and mountain are lost in the turn of the road, and we are fast climbing the hill leading to the great zigzag of Monte Zucco. Still we have seen, however imperfectly, the loftiest of all the giants of Cadore. We have seen the mouth of the famous Ampezzo Thal, and we begin to feel that it is not all a dream, that we are among the Dolomites at last. And now, for a weary while, partly on foot and partly in the carriage, we toil on and on, up the new road constructed of late years by the Emperor Ferdinand. The Piave, here quite choked by a huge stationary mass of pine trunks, winds unheard some hundreds of feet below. Perarolo, the great centre of all this timber trade, dwindles to a toy hamlet in the valley. New peaks rise on the horizon. New valleys glitter in the distance. Still the road climbs, winds among vast slopes of pine forest, makes the entire circuit of Monte Zucco, and finally, with one long last pull, reaches the level of the upper plateau. Here, at Tai Cadore, a tiny village backed by cultivated slopes, we are to take our midday rest. Here, too, we catch our first glimpse of Titian's birthplace, Pieve de Cadore, a small white hamlet nestled in a fold of the hills close under a ruined castle on a wooded knoll, about a mile away. Now Pieve de Cadore was down in our route as a special excursion to be taken hereafter from Cortina in the Ampezzo valley, but our impatience was great, and the sun was shining brilliantly, and our first thought was to employ these 2 hours' rest in walking there and back, and just seeing, though it were only the outside of it, the house in which the great painter was born. It was first necessary, however, to take luncheon at Tai, which we did, seated at a bare table in an upper room of the clean little inn, beside a window commanding a magnificent view of the Prima Maggiore range. Meanwhile the capricious sky clouded over again, and by the time we should have been ready to start, the rain was coming down so heavily that Pieve di Cadore was unavoidably left to be seen later on. A little way beyond Tai Cadore begins one of the finest drives in Europe. The road that enters the Ampezzo Thal at an elevation which can scarcely be less than 1,250 feet above the foaming Boita, and a close, lofty, richly wooded valley, like a sublimer Val d'Anzasa, opens the way to more rugged scenery beyond. Vast precipices tower above, scattered villages cling to the green slopes halfway down, and brilliant passages of light and shadow move rapidly over all. Now one peak is lighted up, and now another. Here a brown roof, wet from the last shower, glistens like silver in the sunshine. There a grassy slope fringed with noble chestnuts glows in a green and golden light, while on yonder opposite height a dark fir forest shows blue and purple in an angry storm shadow. At Vannes the overhanging eaves, outer staircases, and balustraded balconies are wholly Swiss, while inscriptions such as Qui si vende vina d'Asti, coloniale, ed altri generi remind us that, although close upon the Austrian frontier, we are not yet out of Italy. And now the valley widens. The Antelao, still obscured by floating mists, again comes into sight, a near mass of clustered pinnacles, then the Pelmo on the opposite side of the valley, uplifted in the likeness of a mighty throne canopied by clouds, and approached by a giant staircase, each step of which is a precipice laden with eternal snow, and trodden only by the chamois hunter. Next, on the same side as the Pelmo, but farther up the valley, appears the Rochetta, a chain of wild, confused crags like a line of broken battlements, piled high on huge buttresses of sward and pine forest. Beneath the small wayside hamlets of Vodo and Borca the road is cut through an enormous slope of stony débris, the scene of a bergfall which fell from the Antelao in 1816, and overwhelmed two villages on the opposite bank of the Boita. More sudden and almost more cruel than the lava from Vesuvius, it came down, as almost every bergfall comes down, at dead of night, crushing the sleepers in their beds and leaving not a moment for escape. End of section 5.